The biggest mistake people make is believing a person's job tells them their value. Ethan Brooks would remember those words for the rest of his life. The strange thing was that he heard them while pushing a janitor's cart down the polished hallway of St. Margaret Medical Center. Nobody around him knew that the man wearing a gray maintenance uniform and carrying cleaning supplies owned the entire hospital network. To everyone else, he was simply another janitor. Invisible. Replaceable. Easy to ignore. That was exactly why Ethan was there. 6 months earlier, Brooks Healthcare had acquired St. Margaret Medical Center as part of a major expansion. Reports from executives looked impressive. Revenue was increasing. Patient satisfaction scores appeared stable. Management praised the hospital's culture. But Ethan had learned long ago that reports often showed what people wanted leadership to see. The truth usually lived somewhere else. So he developed a habit that surprised everyone who knew him. Several times each year, he entered one of his facilities disguised as an ordinary employee. Sometimes he worked as a receptionist. Sometimes as a kitchen assistant. This time he chose to become a janitor. Nobody paid attention to janitors. That made them perfect observers. His first week confirmed exactly what he expected. Doctors walked past him without making eye contact. Administrators spoke around him as though he were furniture. Some employees left coffee cups and paperwork in places they assumed someone else would clean. One afternoon, Ethan overheard 2 surgeons speaking near the elevators. One glanced toward him and laughed. "Nobody notices the janitors anyway." The other smiled and nodded. Ethan simply continued mopping the floor. Years earlier, comments like that might have bothered him. Now they fascinated him. Every careless word revealed character. Every small action told a story. Then on a rainy Tuesday evening, something different happened. Ethan was replacing trash liners near the emergency department when a young nurse approached carrying patient charts. Unlike everyone else rushing through the corridor, she slowed down. She smiled warmly. "Good evening." Ethan looked up, slightly surprised. "Good evening." The nurse glanced at the heavy trash bags beside him. "Thank you for keeping this place clean. We would be lost without you." Then she continued down the hallway before he could respond. Ethan watched her disappear around the corner. It was only a few seconds. A simple conversation. Yet it stood out because nobody else had spoken to him that way all week. Later he learned her name from a badge clipped to her uniform. Grace Miller. Registered nurse. 27 years old. Over the next several days, he noticed her everywhere. She greeted receptionists by name. She checked on anxious family members waiting outside patient rooms. She stayed late helping coworkers finish paperwork. Most importantly, she treated every person with the same respect. Wealthy patients received kindness. Elderly patients received kindness. Janitors received kindness. One evening, Ethan watched her kneel beside an elderly patient sitting alone in a hallway chair. The woman appeared frightened and confused. Grace patiently explained every step of the treatment process, answered questions, and reassured her until the fear faded from her face. The interaction lasted less than 10 minutes. Nobody applauded. Nobody recorded it. Nobody knew the hospital owner was standing 20 feet away watching everything. As Grace walked away, the elderly patient smiled for the first time all evening. Ethan found himself smiling too. For months he had come searching for the truth about the hospital. What he did not expect was to find someone who reminded him what healthcare was supposed to be about. And without realizing it, the nurse who treated a janitor like a human being had just become the most interesting person in the building. Every morning at 6:30, Ethan pushed his mop through the empty hallways, careful not to make a sound. The fluorescent lights flickered above, casting a sterile glow on the polished tile floor. Grace Miller appeared at the nurse's station, clipboard in hand, bright eyes scanning her assignments. She noticed Ethan immediately, giving him a nod and a quick smile that carried genuine warmth. "Good morning," she said, and Ethan felt the weight of the day lift for a moment. No one else paused to speak to him, yet Grace consistently acknowledged his presence. In the small hours before patients arrived for their morning rounds, she organized medications, answered patient calls, and checked vital charts, moving with a rhythm that was efficient but compassionate. Ethan observed her interactions with the patients. She knelt beside a scared child receiving an injection, held the child's hand, and whispered reassurances that calmed the tears. Another patient, an elderly man confused about his discharge instructions, found patience and clarity through Grace's explanations. Despite the heavy workload, she never glanced at her watch impatiently, never raised her voice, never showed frustration. Ethan noticed the subtle gestures that revealed her dedication, straightening blankets, offering a cup of water, double-checking medication dosages. As he continued his cleaning route, he caught her looking at a patient with empathy that reached beyond professional duty. The receptionist passed by without a word, but Grace lingered, making sure each patient felt seen and heard. During a short break, Ethan leaned against a wall near the supply closet, watching Grace coordinate with other nurses, guiding new staff gently, correcting mistakes with kindness rather than criticism. He realized that her influence extended quietly but effectively, making the entire ward function smoothly. Outside the window, the first rays of sunlight began to filter through, highlighting the dust motes floating above the linoleum floor, but inside, Grace created a warmth that light alone could not provide. Ethan found himself thinking about her constantly during his shifts, noting her habits, her patience, her fairness, and the way she treated everyone equally, regardless of who they were. By the end of the morning, when patients were settled and the hallways quieted for a brief lull, Ethan felt a growing admiration, not just for her skills, but for her character. He understood that Grace Miller's influence went beyond her nursing duties. She embodied the humanity and integrity that kept the hospital alive, and in her presence, even a janitor like him felt noticed, respected, and reminded of the meaning behind every act of kindness he had witnessed that week. 3 weeks into his assignment, Ethan had learned more about St. Margaret Medical Center than any executive report could ever reveal. The hospital looked efficient on paper, but the reality inside its walls was far more complicated. Some employees cared deeply about their patients. Others seemed focused only on completing tasks and moving on to the next shift. Ethan observed everything while pushing his cleaning cart through the hallways, quietly recording notes in a small notebook he kept hidden inside a supply cabinet. One chilly Thursday afternoon, the hospital was busier than usual. Ambulances arrived steadily, phones rang without pause, and staff members hurried through crowded corridors. Ethan was replacing a trash liner near a waiting area when he noticed an elderly woman sitting alone in a wheelchair near the end of a hallway. She appeared confused. A hospital bracelet hung loosely around her wrist. A thin blanket covered her lap. Every few minutes she looked around as if searching for someone. Employees walked past her repeatedly. Some were too busy to stop. Others simply assumed someone else was helping her. Nearly 40 minutes passed. The woman remained alone. Ethan was about to approach when he saw Grace emerge from a patient room carrying a tablet. She immediately noticed the woman. Unlike everyone else, she stopped. "Ma'am, are you all right?" Grace asked gently. The elderly woman looked up with relief. "I think I am supposed to be somewhere, but I cannot remember where." Grace crouched beside the wheelchair. "That is okay. Let us figure it out together." Ethan remained nearby, pretending to organize cleaning supplies while he watched. Grace checked the woman's identification bracelet and quickly discovered what had happened. During a shift change, transportation staff had accidentally left her waiting for an imaging appointment that had already been rescheduled. No one had realized she was still sitting there. Grace could have called someone else to handle it. Instead, she took responsibility herself. She found the correct department, contacted the physician, updated the patient's chart, and stayed with the woman until the confusion was resolved. More importantly, she treated her with patience and dignity. "You are not forgotten," Grace told her softly. "We are going to take care of everything." The woman's eyes filled with gratitude. Ethan noticed something else. Nobody was watching. No supervisors were present. No performance evaluations depended on this moment. Grace gained absolutely nothing from stopping to help. She simply did it because she believed it was the right thing to do. Later that evening, Ethan saw her sitting alone in the staff lounge eating a late dinner from a small container she had brought from home. She looked exhausted. Yet when another nurse entered the room frustrated by a difficult day, Grace listened and encouraged her with the same kindness she showed patients. Ethan found himself smiling. During his years as a CEO, he had met people with impressive resumes, advanced degrees, and powerful titles. Yet genuine character was far rarer. As he returned to his cleaning duties, he wrote a single sentence in his notebook. "The future of this hospital is not determined by its executives. It is determined by people like Grace Miller." He closed the notebook and looked down the quiet hallway. For the first time since arriving at St. Margaret, his mission was becoming personal. The following week brought a change neither of them expected. St. Margaret Medical Center entered one of its busiest periods of the year. Several departments were operating at full capacity, and many employees volunteered for extra shifts to keep patient care running smoothly. Grace seemed to be everywhere at once. Ethan saw her helping new nurses adapt to demanding schedules, calming anxious family members, and stepping into situations that technically fell outside her responsibilities. The more he observed her, the more he understood why patients trusted her so deeply. One evening, shortly after 9 o'clock, Ethan was finishing his cleaning route near the employee cafeteria when he noticed Grace sitting alone at a corner table. A paper cup of coffee sat beside her untouched. Her shoulders looked heavier than usual. For the first time since he had met her, she seemed tired in a way that went beyond a long shift. Ethan hesitated before approaching. "Long day?" he asked. Grace looked up and smiled faintly. "That obvious?" Ethan nodded. "A little." She laughed softly. "Then I guess I am losing my ability to hide it." Ethan sat across from her, careful not to intrude. Around them, the cafeteria had grown quiet. Most employees had already gone home. Outside the large windows, city lights reflected against the darkness. For a moment neither spoke. Then Grace looked down at her coffee. "Sometimes I wonder if I am making any difference." Ethan frowned slightly. "What makes you say that?" She sighed. "There are so many patients. So many problems. Every day feels like trying to empty a lake with a teaspoon." Ethan smiled. "You helped an elderly woman last week who had been forgotten in a hallway." Grace blinked in surprise. "You saw that?" "I did." She looked away modestly. Anyone would have helped her. Ethan shook his head. "No. They did not." The words lingered between them. Grace stared quietly at her coffee cup before speaking again. "My father used to tell me that small acts matter. I guess I still want to believe that." Ethan found himself wondering about the man who had raised her. "Sounds like a smart person." A warm smile appeared on her face. He was. For the next 30 minutes, they talked more than they ever had before. Not about work. Not about hospital procedures. About life. Grace shared stories about growing up in a small town. Ethan told carefully edited stories that protected his identity while still revealing pieces of himself. They laughed about strange hospital moments and difficult customers from old jobs. For the first time, Ethan stopped observing Grace as a CEO evaluating an employee. He simply enjoyed being around her. As the conversation continued, he noticed something important. Grace never asked what he earned. She never questioned his position. She never measured him by status. She treated him exactly the same way she treated everyone else. When their break finally ended, Grace stood and gathered her things. "Thank you," she said. "For listening." Ethan smiled. "Anytime." She headed toward the elevator before turning back briefly. "You know, most people talk to janitors only when they need something cleaned." Ethan laughed. "Occupational hazard." Grace smiled. "Their loss." As the elevator doors closed behind her, Ethan remained standing in the nearly empty cafeteria. For weeks he had been documenting operations, evaluating management, and studying hospital culture. Yet somewhere along the way, the assignment had become something else entirely. And for the first time since beginning his undercover work, Ethan realized he was looking forward to tomorrow for reasons that had nothing to do with business. The following morning, Ethan arrived early, the hospital still cloaked in soft gray dawn light. The janitor uniform felt heavier than usual as he wheeled his cart down the main corridor, listening to the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant beeps of monitors. Grace was already at the nurse's station, her hair neatly pulled back, white scrubs spotless despite the chaotic start to her shift. She noticed Ethan and offered a small wave, her expression warm but focused. He returned a subtle nod, moving on to tidy a waiting area near the pediatric wing. The air was filled with the soft sounds of the hospital awakening, shoes clicking on tile floors, distant announcements over the intercom, murmured conversations between staff. Around 10 o'clock, a situation arose in the emergency wing. A patient, an elderly man suffering from sudden disorientation, wandered slightly into the hallway. No one had immediate time to assist. Ethan moved toward him instinctively, but Grace was already at his side, gently guiding him back into a wheelchair. "Sir, we will take care of you," she said softly. Ethan observed her calmly managing the situation while explaining each step to the man, reassuring him with patience and quiet authority. As the morning unfolded, Ethan noticed Grace navigating multiple tasks seamlessly, coordinating with doctors, checking on patients in critical care, answering questions from anxious family members, all while maintaining a calm and approachable demeanor. She checked on patients overlooked by others, adjusted beds, double-checked medication schedules, and ensured everyone felt heard. Between tasks, she offered encouragement to coworkers, quietly lifting morale without drawing attention to herself. Ethan realized she treated every interaction as if it mattered deeply, whether it was a minor correction for a new nurse or explaining a complex procedure to a worried parent. When he passed the cafeteria later, he noticed Grace sitting briefly with a tray of food, eating slowly while reviewing charts, her exhaustion hidden beneath her professional composure. Despite the long hours, she never allowed fatigue to interfere with compassion. Later, in the oncology ward, Ethan saw Grace kneel beside a child receiving treatment, holding the child's hand while explaining the procedure in a gentle tone. The child relaxed visibly, the fear in her eyes replaced by trust. Ethan's notebook, hidden discreetly in his cart, recorded each detail, every moment revealing the depth of Grace's integrity and dedication. Around mid-afternoon, a young nurse accidentally misread a medication dosage and looked ready to panic. Grace approached quietly, reviewing the chart, correcting the mistake, and providing reassurance without scolding, modeling confidence and support. Ethan paused for a moment to reflect. Despite being the owner of this entire hospital network, he had never witnessed a demonstration of professionalism and human decency on this scale. In every corridor, every room, every interaction, Grace Miller's actions consistently elevated the standard of care. Ethan pushed his cart slowly, absorbing the environment, understanding that true leadership extended beyond titles and financial reports. It existed in the quiet, deliberate actions of individuals committed to doing the right thing. By the end of the shift, as the hospital gradually quieted and patients settled, Ethan realized he was witnessing something rare: heartfelt dedication untainted by recognition or reward, a standard set quietly, firmly, and with extraordinary consistency. His respect for Grace grew with each passing moment, solidifying in his mind that this nurse, unnoticed by most, was in fact the backbone of the hospital's moral and operational strength. By the beginning of his 5th week at St. Margaret Medical Center, Ethan had become familiar with nearly every hallway, department, and employee. He had learned which nurses stayed late without being asked, which supervisors genuinely supported their teams, and which managers seemed more concerned with appearances than patient care. One name appeared repeatedly in his notebook for the wrong reasons: Victoria Hayes. As Director of Administrative Operations, Victoria held considerable influence inside the hospital. On paper, her performance looked excellent. Departments under her supervision met financial targets and efficiency goals. Yet Ethan had observed something different. Victoria treated people according to their position. Physicians received respect. Senior executives received attention. Employees in lower-ranking jobs often received neither. One afternoon, Ethan witnessed it firsthand. He was emptying recycling bins near the administrative offices when Victoria emerged from a conference room carrying several folders. She nearly walked into him before stopping abruptly. Her expression immediately tightened. "You are blocking the hallway," she said sharply. Ethan glanced around. The corridor was nearly empty. "Sorry about that." Victoria frowned as though even the brief conversation annoyed her. "Then pay attention." Without another word, she continued walking. Ethan simply returned to his work. Unfortunately, Grace happened to witness the exchange from nearby. Later that evening, she found Ethan replacing supplies in a storage room. "Victoria was out of line earlier," she said. Ethan shrugged. "I have dealt with worse." Grace folded her arms. "That does not make it acceptable." Ethan smiled slightly. "You seem determined to defend me." "I am determined to defend anyone being treated unfairly." The answer came so quickly that Ethan knew she meant it. For a moment neither spoke. Then Grace laughed softly. "Besides, you are one of the nicest people in this building." Ethan looked away before she could see how much that comment affected him. Unfortunately, Victoria's attitude toward Ethan was only the beginning. Over the next several days, she began questioning Grace's judgment as well. During one staff meeting, Grace suggested a simple improvement that would reduce patient wait times. Several nurses supported the idea immediately. Victoria dismissed it without discussion. "Let us leave operational decisions to management," she said coldly. The room fell silent. Grace did not argue. She simply nodded and continued taking notes. Ethan noticed the disappointment in her eyes. Later, he reviewed hospital records and discovered something troubling. Several employee suggestions that improved patient care had been ignored for months despite strong supporting data. Many came from nurses working directly with patients. The pattern appeared repeatedly. Victoria valued authority more than insight. The discovery earned several pages in Ethan's notebook. A few nights later, Ethan and Grace shared another late coffee break in the cafeteria. The hospital had grown quiet again. Rain tapped softly against the windows. Grace stirred her coffee absent-mindedly. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Of course." She hesitated. "Do you ever feel invisible?" Ethan nearly laughed at the irony. "Sometimes." Grace nodded slowly. "Lately it feels like some people only hear certain voices." Ethan studied her expression carefully. "Then maybe they are listening to the wrong people." Grace smiled. "Maybe." As their conversation continued, Ethan felt something shifting between them. The friendship had become deeper. More personal. More meaningful. At the same time, Victoria's growing influence worried him. Every day revealed new concerns hidden beneath the hospital's polished image. And for the first time since beginning his assignment, Ethan realized that uncovering the truth might place Grace directly in the path of a conflict she never saw coming. The trouble began on a Tuesday afternoon that seemed completely ordinary. The hospital was operating at its usual pace. Nurses moved between patient rooms, physicians reviewed charts, and visitors filled waiting areas with quiet conversations. Ethan spent most of the day working near the surgical wing, observing operations while adding notes to his hidden notebook whenever opportunities arose. Nothing suggested that within a few hours everything would change. Shortly after 3 o'clock, a disagreement erupted inside one of the nursing stations. Ethan noticed the tension immediately. Voices remained professional, but the atmosphere shifted. Staff members exchanged nervous glances. Several nurses stopped what they were doing and gathered around a computer terminal. Grace was standing nearby, her expression confused. Ethan slowly approached while pretending to empty a recycling container. He quickly learned the source of the problem. A medication record contained an error. Fortunately, the mistake had been identified before it affected patient care, but hospital policy required a full review. The question was simple. Who made the mistake? Grace appeared genuinely surprised when her name was mentioned. "That cannot be right," she said calmly. "I reviewed that chart twice." Another nurse looked uncomfortable. "The system shows your login credentials." Grace frowned. "Then something is wrong." Within an hour, administrators became involved. Victoria Hayes arrived and immediately took control of the discussion. Ethan watched carefully from across the hallway. Grace attempted to explain her concerns, but Victoria seemed uninterested in hearing them. "The records are clear," Victoria stated. "The review process will determine what happens next." Grace nodded professionally, but Ethan could see the worry in her eyes. Over the following days, the situation worsened. An internal investigation began. Although no patient had been harmed and Grace maintained an excellent employment record, rumors spread quickly throughout the hospital. Employees who had once greeted her warmly became distant. Some avoided conversations altogether. Others whispered when she entered a room. Ethan found the transformation disturbing. The same people who praised Grace only days earlier now seemed eager to assume the worst. One evening, he discovered her sitting alone outside the hospital near a small employee garden. The autumn air felt cool. Fallen leaves covered the walking paths. Grace stared quietly at the fountain in the center of the courtyard. "Mind if I sit here?" Ethan asked. She managed a small smile. "Not at all." For several moments neither spoke. Finally Grace sighed. "I keep replaying everything in my head." Ethan remained silent, allowing her to continue. "I know I did not make that mistake." She looked down at her hands. "But the more people question you, the more you start questioning yourself." Ethan understood exactly what she meant. "Sometimes the easiest story is not the correct story." Grace glanced at him. "What if nobody believes that?" Ethan looked toward the fountain. "Then the truth becomes even more important." The words seemed to comfort her slightly. Yet as they sat together beneath the fading sunlight, Ethan felt growing concern. Earlier that day he had reviewed system access reports available through channels only a CEO could access. Something about the investigation felt wrong. The timeline did not match. Certain records appeared inconsistent. And the more information he uncovered, the more one detail continued to stand out. Every path seemed to lead back toward decisions made within Victoria Hayes's department. For the first time since arriving at St. Margaret, Ethan suspected that Grace was not merely facing a misunderstanding. Someone might be setting her up to take the blame for a much larger problem. The following morning, the hospital felt unusually quiet as staff filtered in for the early shift. Ethan arrived first, pushing his janitor cart with deliberate calm, taking note of every detail along the hallways. He paused to glance at the main nurse's station, where Grace Miller already worked with methodical efficiency, reviewing charts and checking on patients with an attentive eye. The tension from the previous week still lingered, subtle yet perceptible, as whispers and cautious glances followed Grace from room to room. Around mid-morning, an urgent call came from the pediatric wing. A child experiencing severe allergic reaction needed immediate attention. Grace reacted instantly, directing a nurse to retrieve emergency medication while comforting the child with gentle words, her presence calming the frantic parents. Ethan noticed how naturally she assumed leadership, despite the recent tension with administration. As he moved to clean the hallway near the emergency entrance, he overheard a discussion in a small conference room. Victoria Hayes and other senior staff reviewing incident reports. Ethan stayed out of sight, but he could hear Victoria questioning protocols and subtly implying negligence among nurses, her tone sharp and condescending. Grace passed by shortly after, unaware of the scrutiny behind closed doors. Later that afternoon, Ethan found her sitting briefly in the staff lounge, sipping coffee while checking notes. He approached quietly. "Rough morning?" he asked. Grace looked up, eyes tired but resolute. "Some people still do not see the bigger picture," she replied, her voice steady. Ethan nodded. "You've handled the pediatric emergency flawlessly. No one could fault your actions." She smiled faintly. "I just hope others recognize it soon." Around 4 o'clock, an unexpected inspection team arrived, reviewing records and auditing procedures. Grace remained professional, answering questions concisely while assisting with the logistics of the visit. Ethan observed from a distance, admiring her ability to maintain composure under pressure. The inspection concluded without incident, but the tension remained thick, and whispers of Victoria's dissatisfaction continued. As evening approached, Ethan and Grace moved through the corridors together, assisting with final rounds. The day's events had tested the limits of staff endurance, yet Grace's calm and composed demeanor inspired confidence among those around her. They paused outside the pediatric wing, watching the sunset cast a warm glow through large windows. Ethan spoke quietly. "It is remarkable how you continue to rise above it all." Grace glanced at him, a mix of appreciation and humility on her face. "Sometimes you just do what is right, regardless of recognition." For a moment, silence passed between them, the weight of recent events hanging subtly in the air. The hospital's halls emptied, and a soft stillness enveloped the building. Ethan realized that the challenges Grace faced went beyond mere protocols or administrative pressures. She carried the emotional weight of caring for others in a system that often overlooked the quiet heroes. And in that realization, a new sense of respect and awareness settled between them, solidifying a silent bond forged by shared understanding and mutual recognition of integrity in the face of adversity. By the end of the 6th week, Ethan's notebook was nearly full. Every page contained observations, employee interactions, procedural concerns, and examples of exceptional service. One name appeared more often than any other: Grace Miller. Not because Ethan intended to focus on her. The truth was simpler. She consistently gave him reasons to. The investigation surrounding the medication record remained active, but no conclusions had been announced. Grace continued reporting for every shift, refusing to allow uncertainty to affect her patients. Ethan admired her determination, yet he could see the strain growing heavier with each passing day. The whispers had not disappeared. Some co-workers still avoided her. Others offered sympathy but maintained their distance. It was easier to support someone after they had been proven innocent. Standing beside them beforehand required courage. One rainy evening, Ethan found Grace sitting alone near the hospital's small chapel. The room was quiet except for the distant sound of rain tapping against stained glass windows. She stared ahead thoughtfully, her hands folded in her lap. "Mind if I join you?" Ethan asked. Grace smiled softly. "I was hoping you would." Ethan sat beside her. For a moment neither spoke. Then Grace laughed quietly. "You know something strange?" "What?" "You are probably the person I talk to most these days." Ethan felt an unexpected warmth in his chest. "I am honored." She looked toward the floor. "Most people are careful around me right now." Ethan understood exactly what she meant. People become afraid when uncertainty enters the picture. Grace nodded. "Maybe." She paused before continuing. "But you never changed." Ethan looked away briefly. If only she knew how difficult that had become. Every day he uncovered more evidence suggesting she had been unfairly targeted. Every day the urge to reveal the truth grew stronger. Yet doing so too early could jeopardize everything. The investigation needed time. The hospital needed answers. And Grace deserved complete justice, not a temporary rescue. "Can I ask you something?" she said. Ethan nodded. "What do you think happens when someone works hard for years and still gets blamed?" Ethan considered the question carefully. "I think the truth usually takes longer to arrive than lies." Grace smiled faintly. "That sounds like something my father would say." They sat quietly as rain continued falling outside. Then Grace surprised him. "Sometimes I wonder what your life was like before this job." Ethan nearly laughed. If she knew. Private aircraft. Corporate boardrooms. National conferences. Multi-billion-dollar acquisitions. Yet none of those things felt important sitting beside her. "Nothing very exciting," he answered gently. Grace raised an eyebrow. "I do not believe that." Ethan smiled. "Maybe one day I will tell you." The words lingered between them. For a brief moment, something deeper passed through the silence. Not just friendship. Not just trust. Something neither of them was ready to name. Then Grace looked away first. Well, when that day comes, I will listen. Ethan watched the rain slide down the chapel windows. His heart felt unexpectedly heavy. Because the story he wanted to tell her was the one story he could not tell. Not yet. Later that night, after Grace returned to her shift, Ethan accessed another round of internal records through secure executive channels. Within minutes, he discovered something that made him sit perfectly still. A system audit had identified unauthorized access linked to administrative credentials. The timeline matched the medication incident exactly. And every piece of evidence pointed toward a single department, under Victoria Hayes's control. For the first time, Ethan knew with certainty that Grace had been telling the truth all along. The problem was no longer proving her innocence.